Cool. So there's a story about a um, a prince that turned into a dragon at night, and he was trying to get married. But the problem was that every night, every time he got married, he ate his bride on the wedding night. So there was a young farmer's girl who figure out how to deal with this problem. And of course, she met an old woman who taught her how to deal with that stuff. So she got married to the prince, and she then proceeded during the wedding night to follow the directions of the wise old lady, and she took the prince through this sort of masochist bed chamber torture process where, where she gradually unveiled her naked body, thereby forcing him to shed his serpent hides until he was like a bleeding lump of meat on the ground. And then she whipped him and washed him with lye. So apparently a very painful process, and that then produced him as a useful human prince that she could then marry. Now that story I think it has a deep mythic and initiatory actually meaning to it, and it represents something about how relation can be made in overcoming meeting other, actually the monstrous that we are interacting with somehow. And I actually got this tale from my grandparents when I was a kid. Yeah, here it is. Let me just find it. And here's an image of
Oh
the
yeah,
woman the woman
yeah.
whipping the dragon. Now, the funny thing was that I once actually shared this image here with a description and with a little analysis that this is I think it's an initiatory expression of eroticism and something about female power and these kind of things. So there was a Facebook group where I think they were identifying as witches, and I shared this image, and they blocked it because it was conflictual. And it really made me wonder. I mean, I got this image of like female erotic power and initiatory mysticism, and I find it incredibly, the meaning's incredibly beautiful. And my sweet and church going grandparents, they gave me to this they gave this this book to me where in 83 I must have been 8 years old then, so apparently they didn't find that it was
Right.
too much in those days. They probably didn't think about it in exactly those terms, but anyway. So I just think this is a funny example of uh, of the encounter basically between this very powerfully animist in my view, and like it's a really powerful image. um you could almost say that the story itself is almost a bit abusive. It's in itself an animist technology, almost as if the story itself wants to reach out to you and like pull you a little bit into some sort of Sundance like try
Absolutely.
ordeal. um, and
Yeah.
when this kind of stuff is brought into the contemporary spaces, then it meets rather strong reaction, even from people who identify as witches.
Totally. Right.
um,
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for that story. I grew up with mythology too as a kind of, I didn't know it at the time, but it was sort of like a protective, like I grew up in the inner city, New England, mixed race kid, not a lot of friends, very violent, neighborhoods, and no one really had really great emotional ability, right? Like everyone's kind of angry and scared all the time. So I sort of found myself gravitating towards mythology and fantasy and science fiction and sort of like cartoon animism, right? Like cartoon animism, because when you think about when you think about how culture has kind of hidden its animist ways or like hidden its witchcraft, you can look at things like Bugs Bunny, Looney Tunes, Mickey Mouse, right? Because Bugs Bunny is a trickster, is a rabbit figure from the old days, just
Mm,
kind of wrapped in new clothing for, the children and marketable. And I do think that there is something interesting about the more we think we're getting more sophisticated.
mm,
We think we're getting more sophisticated, but actually we're actually getting simpler and not more complex, right?
mm.
And I
Yeah.
actually think that the animists of our old ancestors, they might not have had terms like, feminism or intersectionality or things like that. They didn't have
Mm,
those terms, but I think it's because they didn't quite need them, you
mm.
know? I think there might have been something deeper that we're missing that was actually more complex than the kind of the things that we've kind of burst forth from, because essentially a lot of these things are reactions to a highly violent oppression for the last few hundred years, right?
Mm,
Like we have now things like labor rights
mm,
because for
mm.
hundreds of years our ancestors in all directions, a lot of them were enslaved by kings and queens and things like that. So I'm actually very interested personally in going back further than contemporary history cares about, because I want to understand how people lived, like 300,000 years ago, not just 2,000 years ago, right? Because I actually think there was more complexity, but maybe simpler language, but more complex um, behaviors, right?
Totally. Yeah,
And
totally.
you were talking about, well, we were prepping for this. So anyway, let's just do a quick intro. Rune of Nordic Animism. I am so happy to finally have this conversation with you. I've been following your work for a little while, and I think we're in the same puddle of muck. I think we're in the same puddle of muck, but
That's a
we're
good
but
place to
we're
be, man.
but we're on
Awesome.
different locations. So I'm living in so-called Portland, Oregon, on the west coast of the so-called United States. That's Chinook territory, unceded land. And just tell us a bit about where you're arising from, where you're living and inhabiting.
Well, I'm from southern part of Scandinavia. I'm Danish, and I'm living in Danish unceded land. and,
Yeah.
but and Yeah, I'm a historian of religion. I've done a lot of anthropology. A lot of my work, actually, my academic work, was actually focused on Afro-Atlantic religions. I did in fact, I did both my my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD on different aspect of Afro-Brazilian religion. So and Particularly my work during my PhD, I found the encounter with Afro-Brazilian religion to be extremely enlightening. So, for those listeners or viewers who don't know what that is, it's a kind of Orisha religion. So it's very comparable to the Cuban Santeria or the Haitian Voodoo. But Yes, so that's kind of my background. And then I've been well, since my childhood and also throughout the years, I've also been working on and being interested in Western cultural history, and particularly Scandinavian Nordic tradition, which is the tradition that's comes from the space that I also come from, and that then I'm trying to communicate today in the idea of Nordic animism, and it's actually quite inspired by the Orisha religion, but it wouldn't be very visible to you if you go and look at my channel, because it's because these priestesses, they to a quite large extent, they taught me how to think. Brazilian religion is a super beautiful queer matriarchal, hyper-inclusive, contemporary, traditional polytheism that has survived with an incredible capacity to resist modern subjugation or modernist Euro-modernist subjugation. And that is also why that the foundational ways of thinking are, I think, useful for pretty much anybody in the world today. So you also see indigenous peoples in Brazil, for instance, that they are sort of they're using the ways of thinking that have been developed by the Afro-descendants in order to re-indigenize and reconnect with their ancestrality and so on. And so that you could say that way of thinking it's inside my way of addressing my own heritage as a Eurocent. And I think now I'm presenting this as Nordic animism because I'm from Northern Europe. But I really think that these ways of, for instance, looking at Western Euro-descendant culture as a process of rejecting specific practices and knowledge forms and processes, that is something you could use from wherever you are in the world that has been defined by modernity. If you were from Romania or France or wherever, these ways of thinking could work in probably exactly the same way.
Right. You're just applying the way of thinking to your context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Um,
that's this,
yeah.
this is the kind of, because for people you might not have watched some of my videos, but for those who are sort of hip to what I've been doing with Larissa, we are very big on finding a kind of non-appropriative cross patterning of animism that could
Mm,
be used and it's not decontextualized animism, it's patterns of thinking and behavior and relating that then have to be applied to whatever actual context you're actually in,
mm,
which is
mm.
going to be different for different people. And you have
Yeah.
to understand, like, people have to get that it needs to be different for different people
Mm,
in different
mm,
contexts, but that if you are versed enough or fluent enough in this kind of pattern recognition, you actually can see underlying principles, and
mm.
that's actually how you connect to other animists.
Yeah.
You don't connect on the surface, you connect under the surface,
Mm, mm.
because you're both able to see the kind of meta context,
Yeah.
like the meta narrative that you're using
Mm,
to relate to the land and to
mm,
death and to the ancestors,
mm.
etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's it's a very good way of describing it. It's a very good way of describing it. Like one example of this sort of you could say pattern thinking is that when you look at how the West African ethnicity that's called the Yoruba, how they have recreated or continued renewing their relation to their Orisha deities, then one thing that plays a role is Catholic saints. They camouflage Orisha deity with Catholic saints. But this camouflage is not just a camouflage. The saint is not completely irrelevant there. It's not only a mask, because this is a masking cult. So masks are actually really, really important. So, so there's some really complex things going on there.
Right,
Now,
right.
if you look at North European history, you find something that looks remarkably similar in the early Middle Ages when a lot of saints started appearing that just looks very, very much like specific pre-Christian deities. So, and that means that the way of thinking that, in this case, I kind of got to know through the Orisha religion, when I turn that eye to the history religions of my own area, then I can recognize these processes and see, okay, so that means that we can think of Saint Eric of Sweden, in a similar way as the Cubans think about Santa Barbara or something like that, as
Right.
a saint, which is really a key or a channel to
Right.
a deity.
Well, we see this too with sort of Tibetan Dzogchen and those kinds of sort of Vajrayana traditions is that you're taught to sort of visualize, hyper visualize very complex deities, but beings, anthropomorphized beings. But that is a way to basically enter into a mentorship with the ideals behind that deity, which is to say that the deity is a doorway, right? Like there's a doorway to becoming a pathway that is not binary and is not sort of two-dimensional. There's
mm,
a sort of multi-dimensional opening through time that starts to happen, because going in any direction, if you do it in a certain way, leads you to all directions, right? It's like
mm,
ancient ancestors might have worshipped, say, like a mountain deity that we might not have a name for anymore, right?
mm,
Like the name has been covered by layers of sediment, right? Just like the
mm,
saint
mm,
comes in and it gets absorbed,
mm,
right? Like the syncretic
mm,
absorption of like the
yeah,
Virgin Mary in like South America, right? It's like,
mm,
whoop. And
mm,
so then you have a combination of the Virgin Mary with like Aztec and Mayan mother figures, and now you are that's all involved. That's all there now. It's not
mm,
like one is
mm.
erasing the other. It's
No,
just extra. It's like
exactly. Yeah,
you add to the formula, right?
yeah, yeah. I think you could almost view this as part of the process of the, what's the word now in English? Anyway, the almost like the biological circulation or the life circulation of other than human subjectivity, that they other than human subjectivities are very transformative. Now that means that, and a lot of a lot of Westerners would have a tendency to think of stuff like, say, pre-Christian Nordic religion or something like that, or have a tendency to think about it as this very static thing that has to be this very well-ordered little gallery of deities and its whole little Olympic little soap opera going on there,
Totally.
but it's sort of, there's some static quality to how people imagine it. However, what it's these beings that are essentially there, not essentially, but you, from scholarship perspective, you can also perceive them as relational hubs that produce relating through between a group of people and a complex of stuff in the world, and um and but they're very transformative, and they are transforming through the ages. They're transforming with shifting social structures and shifting
Right.
peoples and so on. And I think that's part of why they are also relatively permissive. It's if Ogum moves to from Nigeria to Brazil, then wow, okay, Saint George, yeah, let me let that be a little bit of my transformational process, and so these exchanges or transformation are, I think I don't understand it. I don't understand it, all the way down, but I just think it's there's something really important about that.
Right. Well, I mean, for me, I identify as a mixed race person. So I want to get into this a little bit more, because all my life growing up in New England before the internet, right? So in the 80s, before the internet like really
Mm,
existed, the simplisticness of white culture, which wasn't even called white culture before, because before the
mm,
internet, there was just, oh, this is normal, but it's white,
mm,
like it's just
yeah.
default. It's like, no, this is just something else. But anyway, like everyone always is asking a mixed race kid, what are you?
Yeah.
Which is that like terrible microaggression that no one wants to deal with today. But I think it's very telling, because when they ask that question, those kinds of people want a very simple answer, which is this static thing that you talked about, which is like,
Yeah.
I need a place to put you that is a box that I know doesn't change.
Mm,
And being a mixed race person is a lot like polytheism and is a
mm,
lot like syncretic traditions, because you can't choose. If you are
mm,
actually want to be a whole person and
mm,
not just a bunch of split up pieces of cake or something, you know? Like
Mm.
I'm 50% this and I'm 50% that. Like, how does that actually work? You
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
but the philosophy that I'm coming from is that like it's a bit of you have to become multiple, you have to become plural, and
Mm,
that led me to sort of like queer ecology
mm,
and queer theory because you are not just a thing, you are a pleroma of things. You are a
mm,
kind of hologram
yeah,
um, of forces. And in order to be a whole being, you have to include not only, you know, my mom is from these places and my dad is from these places and those ethnic cultures, but you also have to include things like bacteria, viruses, fungi, and
mm,
the land that you're on. Like you have to do it. Like you have,
mm,
like if you're gonna go all the way to be a
mm,
whole person, you have to go all the way. And
mm,
I what I've noticed in my work as like a racial educator, a racial justice educator, but also as like an animist and a trauma
mm,
counselor and all this stuff, is I've noticed that if you are a so-called white person, regardless of whether you're French or
mm,
Scandinavian or whatever, but you can kind of go, oh yeah, I'm white and I know I'm white. Those kinds of people have the hardest time becoming multiple,
mm,
becoming plural, unless they have either had a disability. This is where it gets
mm,
interesting. If they've had a disability, as in like,
mm,
you know, a real like physical, mental, or, you know, immune disability,
mm,
which includes things like autoimmune disease or sort of being paralyzed or even like hearing voices,
mm,
those people, so disabled, what we would call disabled, but really the term is stupid, right? What we would call disabled white people seem to have an easier time becoming multiple because they've always had to think like that.
mm.
And when you compare disabled people thinking about how to navigate an ableist white American culture and Black people having to navigate an ableist white American culture, you actually see very similar patterns.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And so this is the
totally.
kind of thing that's very interesting is that like white people seem to be so fucking lonely. And I think the loneliness comes from this lack of animistic relational plurality,
Mm,
right? Like you don't have the relationship of the river, the raven, and all of these totemic relationships.
yeah,
So you can only say, well, I don't, you either say I'm white or I don't know who I am.
yeah. I imagine that the loneliness that you're talking about also, I'm just speculating now a
Yeah,
little bit
totally.
that it perhaps also has to do with that white people are the most iconically modern and the ones that have been when you talk about knowledge hierarchies and
Yeah.
what knowledges dominate other knowledges,
Yes.
then white people are the most colonized. We're the ones whose traditional knowledge has been not eradicated the most because other people's have
Yeah.
experienced atrocious things, but it has been pushed away from our self-image.
Yes,
It's been
there it
pushed
is.
very far away from our self-image by this identity as modern, and
Yeah.
that I think that gives you cosmic loneliness or cosmic tristesse,
Yeah,
like
totally.
in the national I no, there are two national icons in Denmark where I'm from here. One is the flag, and get back to that, but the second is it's just an image of that. It's called the Little Mermaid, and it's an image of a little mermaid who were abandoned by her human relation, her human lover. The prince. Apparently, she didn't have a wise old woman to teach her how to
Yeah,
get the prince in line. So
totally.
she so the prince abandoned her,
Yeah.
and that human abandoning the landscape spirit. Southern Scandinavia is a sea area, so this sea relation is completely extremely important for these people, and so this little figure is an image of this little mermaid sitting and longing basically for the human who has abandoned her. And in fact, just 10 minutes away, there's another statue. It's in front of the parliament. It's submerged under the water, and it is a man, a merman, who was also left by the human who didn't want to be with him anymore. It's the same kind of story, and he and the children are standing below the surface, reaching up for the human to return to relation with the land. So it's these compelling images that sort of emerge in our culture as kind of I think icons of this cosmic tristesse and desperation and perhaps depression of unrelatedness.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I'm fully with you there because I think that the signs are, it's like subtext is all around us. Like subtext is all around us, and when you become a student of like listening for subtext and animism, you can kind of start to pick up these stories, these mythologies that are sort of buried underneath modern metaphor, right? The kind of modernist kind of behavior that people think about, like the individualist narrative, right? You can kind of feel underneath it towards this absence, right?
Mm,
But it's funny because the thing about absences are that they're absences. They're not things. They're
mm,
non-things. So
mm,
I think a lot of what animism has taught me to do is to stare at the nothing until it becomes something, because it's
mm,
not nothing, right?
mm,
It's not nothing. It's like sometimes I lead people through active imagination or guided imagery or something
mm,
into their own whatever, their emotional issue or whatever. And sort of inevitably, this pattern happens, which is they'll come to a moment and they'll go, something's happening. Oh, now it's just black. Now it's just
mm,
darkness. And then they'll skip over it and look somewhere else and be like, oh, but there's something happening over here.
mm,
And inevitably, I have to go, take a second, take a breath, zoom out a little, like sit back in your chair a little
mm,
bit, zoom out, and just look at the thing that's not like, look at the darkness.
mm.
Just look at the darkness.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
And inevitably, if they don't panic and freak out and sort of talk themselves out of it, inevitably something will emerge from the
Yeah,
darkness.
yeah,
And the darkness itself becomes intelligent. Like the
yeah.
darkness, it's like a kind of inky squid being or something.
Mm,
And I think that like that what I say there in individuals, I don't think is individual. I think
mm,
that's the collective issue,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah. No, I think I think it's incredibly nice what you're saying there. The and I think darkness is something that we are lacking in our life. I mean, um, we used to live half the year in darkness almost,
Yes. Right.
and uh, and it's practical and nice to be able to flick on the light, but I know a wise old woman who she lives in a little hippie community in the outskirts of Copenhagen, and she's also a shaman teacher and so on. And they basically started. She basically started to tell people to stay in darkness, go out in the forest and just stay with darkness. And she says she does it herself, like also in her daily life. She just controls the and I think that is that they're probably like this. I don't know exactly what it does to you, but I think it probably does some healthy things to you if your objective is to get in a direction of animist connectedness with other than humans and these kind of things.
Totally.
Um,
Right. And something about the longing too, because it's like in Western culture, we want to fix things.
mm,
We want to sort of skip the part where things are confusing
mm,
and messy, right?
mm,
And in some way, like the Little Mermaid longing for the humans, and when I think of longing, I think of like this a span of air that has atmosphere to it, right? Like if
mm,
I'm longing for something, there's kind of like a thickness in the air,
mm,
right?
mm,
And for me, it's not necessarily even about what I'm longing for. It's about that thickness in the air first.
mm,
So I think that Westerners or moderns or white people or whatever you want to say, we are very we're very sort of fragile around dealing with those kinds of relationships, as in like dealing with looking at the darkness and not having an answer, dealing with the longing without a solution to the longing,
mm,
right? Like we're
mm,
like dealing with the kind of messy,
mm,
confusing aspect of like things that are sort of normalized when you go to indigenous cultures with initiation or you're in the woods. You're kind of
mm,
always surrounded by a kind of almost like it's slightly menacing quality of
mm.
not knowing what the fuck is going on,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, totally, totally. And yeah, uh, and that's quite an important aspect of initiation, and for initiation to work. And I think also what you're talking about here with messiness, that might also actually turn back to some of the weird, some of the characteristics of that weird clusterfuck, which is whiteness. You know, um, the way that the modern world is constructed is that we think about the world and then we order it as a piece of mathematics or a puzzle, something like that, and we order it inside our minds, and that's supposed to be in kind of a bonsai image of what the world is supposed to look like out there. But and this here, I think, is a key actually to understand some of what you were talking about earlier. That in fact, animisms in past times had really, really complex ways of engaging the world, but perhaps they didn't talk about it so much. Perhaps they didn't have languages. No, but what they did have was that they had ways of engaging and practices. And these practices, they are often constructed in ways that take as the starting point the very, very messy character of reality. They do not rest on, for instance, wanting to impose on reality this ordered cosmology image kind of thing. So and again, I learned some of this from these Afro-Brazilians. So you can take them as an example, but you can find it in all other indigenous realities probably, but for instance, if you ask these priestesses, what is an orisha, what is a god, then you can get these wildly contradictory images out of it, like, oh, it's a pre-colonial Yoruba king who became a god after he died. Oh, it's a force of nature, it's a symbol of Black empowerment, it's a Catholic saint, it's a protective father that takes care of me, it's an abusive lover that takes me violently in possession. It's a child that I, as a priestess, need to rear into knowing how to become itself when it's manifest in the god, in the cult. So you see, these images of what the deity is are so radically contradictory, and and the reason they're supposed to be contradictory, and they are because they each do a different thing. They're parts of extremely complex technologies of handling other than human subjectivities.
Right.
The abusive lover that rapes me image, what does that do? It objectifies you. It does something to you, something along the lines of what the peasant girl were doing to the prince, right?
Yeah.
She objectifies the prince, and that's an animist technology. It's
Yeah.
not about legitimizing rape or anything like
No,
that. It's not
no, no,
about
no.
saying sexual violence is okay. It's
Yeah.
not a prescription. And this is also what a lot of Westerners would kind of, they would see this and they would say, oh, this is a prescription of sexual violence. It's
Right.
not. It's the myth in itself does something to your
Right.
subjectivity and opens it in a specific
Right.
way.
Right.
And the image of the same deity as a child being reared in cult, that enables the technologies of teaching the deity, for instance, teaching a deity how to dance. So you have Ogun, the powerful war god, possessing a person, dancing around, and then you have a priest dancing in front of him, teaching him how to become himself, how to become Ogun in the dancing. Now this complexity in practice is it builds on an acknowledgement and handling of the world as inherently super messy.
Yes. Right. Right. But and I would say that it's an antidote for fragility
Yeah, totally, totally.
because
Yeah.
these kinds of practices are not they're not like, oh, I did it and now I'm done with it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, oh, I did that. I got my black, like some weird like badge of honor or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's like these are ongoing relational transformative discourses between what we call a person and what we call a not person.
Mm-hmm.
And in the practice of doing that, all of those person not person definitions are completely and utterly destroyed
Mm-hmm.
because you have to destroy them to get to something that is more flexible, coherent, complex, resilient, robust, all these words that we use to describe things that we want to be,
Mm-hmm.
flexible,
Mm-hmm.
adaptive. All of these things are not like they're not products you can buy off of a shelf. Oh, I want to go buy adaptation for $30.
Mm-hmm.
Adaptation itself is a side effect of getting fucked up in this
Mm-hmm.
process, right? Like
Yeah.
like going into a process by which you are perpetually confused and you don't die
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
results in a side effect that we call adaptation, but you can't
Mm-hmm.
actually point to adaptation. You
Mm-hmm.
can't be like, oh, I want that one. Let me get that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that like somehow in the process by which moderns are inevitably breaking their modernity because it doesn't suit itself to the actual world, right? Like the modern shell, the way that we project out and try to like beep boop beep boop beep, do this thing with the world, like you're this and you're that, ha ha
Mm-hmm.
ha, you know, because that doesn't work. It literally doesn't produce enough good results that would keep it alive, just like evolution,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like it doesn't
Yeah.
produce enough
Yeah.
nutrition, so it's gonna
Mm-hmm.
fucking die, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. The problem is that this death is a big thing. It's like
totally.
it's the biggest catastrophe
Yeah, shit.
since the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And like I've been trying in my mind, I was thinking about the last couple of days, if we have the time that we have been alive, and the time since the ancient Sumer, now that's
Yeah.
5,000 years of 7,000 years or something like that, then we are probably like this. If we have ancient Sumer in the time that they've been humans, that's 2 million years. So that's probably nothing. If you have those 2 million years in the space since the last great extinction, which I think was the dinosaurs, that's 70 million years. That is as long time ago as it is that we faced a bigger extinction than the one that the modernity is wrecking on the world. It's the dimensions are almost beyond
Right.
fathom, right?
I
And
mean, it's very mythical. It's as mythical as if you really thought about the process of like, you look at the Greek myths or you look at the Sumerian myths or whatever, and maybe in like 3 pages at the beginning, they sort of like make the world like there's a Genesis story, right?
mm, mm,
Like what is it, the one about the Greeks? It's like there were Titans and then there were the son, the kids, and the kids killed the Titans, and then they go on and have all their soap opera adventures, right?
yeah,
But I was always like fascinated by how quickly people skip through the beginning because
mm,
the beginning is fucking crazy.
yeah,
Like there were titans that were so big and they had 400 heads and they gave birth to everything, and then they had kids and those kids killed them, and it was like this crazy cataclysm, and then they made the world out of their dead bodies and stuff. And it's like, okay, that chapter's done, and I'm like, but no, that like
yeah,
that piece of the story is
mm,
enough for thousands of stories,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
like just the emotional ramifications of what that means,
mm, yeah, yeah,
right? Like,
totally, totally.
right?
And with mythologies, it's often it's like that they're so intensely disruptive for your cognition. That if you hear people who have actual deep understanding, actual express the mythology to you, you will physically feel bad and want to lie down because it's created to basically to do a little bit to your mind what the peasant girl were doing to the
Right. No, it's a transformative struggle, but it's not even a consensual struggle. And I think that that's the interesting thing about modern culture is that people are so interested in like things like trauma and PTSD and consent. They don't necessarily get to the point where this transformative experience of being with the earth is not consensual. Like
Mm,
it's not like you can be like, okay, I agree for you to tear me apart.
mm,
In fact, if you look at shamanic texts or anthropological texts, nobody is like, oh, I went and ordered this off the menu.
yeah.
You know, like there's a real
Yeah,
like there's a real like I went crazy and got sick and I didn't know
yeah,
what was happening. And
yeah, yeah. It's
so
very, yeah.
it's interesting that like what I think the earth might be essentially ritually demanding of humans, and this is my
Mm,
like mythology,
yeah.
is ritually demanding of humans to sort of like enter that process.
Perhaps, yeah,
Perhaps,
and
you know,
a
and
lot
so
and a
it's
lot of people are talking about something like that today. That we are standing in a global initiatory process,
yeah,
and people talking about apocalypse. The word apocalypse means revelation. That the true state of the modernist capitalist order is being revealed to us, and yeah, and what you're also seeing globally is an enormous attention towards, for instance, earth-focused religiosities. And you see this in a host of European countries, that traditional earth-focused religiosities is a huge movement. You see it among Afro descendants in I think both North and South America. You see it hugely among indigenous populations, and so I think there's a goal that this calamity that we are entering, I think, is basically awakening sensations of renewed or transformative ways of dealing with spirituality,
yeah,
something like that.
totally.
Um,
So let's zoom in a little bit because, you know, I want to hear about some of your experiences trying to sort of like bring this way of thinking to, you know, the place in Europe that you're actually in. And we'll maybe do a little compare and contrast because like I don't think that the culture where I live is the same culture as yours. I think that America is its own thing, and I think that Europe is its own thing, and then you can subdivide that, you know, a lot. But I'm very interested in zooming in a little bit to like we've talked about these worldviews and these kind of big meta, not even problems, but inquiries or kind of like transformative
mm,
inquiries, right? Um, Now it's like I want to get into basically like how are you finding your work on the ground? You know, how are you
yeah,
finding your work on the ground?
yeah, I'm trying, uh, both partly drawn to, you might say, but also actively trying to sort of reach from this kind of intellectual thinking, theorizing space, and into an actual doing space, a space of eco-activism or ceremonial uh, activities or ceremonial activism and these kind of things, basically because of what I was just saying before, that there is this modern idea that we're sitting inside of our enclosed minds, and then we are putting all the bits and pieces together so it looks like a well-ordered aesthetic machine, and then it's true, you know. And and I want to try to break out of that, and I think that and and that is challenging, it's fun, it's difficult, Sometimes it's transgressive. It's academically very problematic.
Yeah.
which which is funny to say, but it's also actually, I think it means that I risk marginalizing myself as a scholar and limiting my career opportunities significantly, because I'm not I actively do not enclose myself in for instance in academic spaces where there's very tight ways of talking. I'm like, nah, fuck man, let me go out in the world and speak to anybody, and if people are hippies then that's great, and so on. And so yeah, so then that I'm trying to do it in different ways. For instance, I think it started, and that project is perhaps still a little bit like mind game thing, that I made a calendar. I basically wrote a book about calendar and about the year in Nordic animism and what happens all around the year. And then I've been basically publishing a new wall calendar, like when you go to the mechanics and the images of naked girls on the wall. We don't have naked girls. We have something a little bit more tasteful, but beautiful images. So that is an attempt to make something that people can sort of use in their daily life. It's a little bit of a manual. Yeah. Then I've been doing and I think the most practice-oriented thing I've been doing is basically organizing an annual cultural event, which is called the Yule Goat, and it's connected to old Christmas traditions, where we basically do a Carnivalesque. We say, okay, there's an aspect of traditional Yule, and that's Carnival, and we want that back. So we make a procession where we sort of take back some of the old Yule figures and the Yule goats and the devils and the transsexual goddesses and all that, all cool stuff, that was kind of purified out of culture, in order to make it boring and bourgeois. And so we're sort of trying to look at all that and then give it a contemporary shape, basically. And we've been doing that every year. So that's basically creating a ceremony. And when we're doing that, it's fun, and it's about, we have a samba orchestra. They don't play samba, they play something else, but the guy is a samba guy, and people put on rubber masks and drink rum and have a good time. And so that's so on the one hand it's fun and it's doing something, and that's a point, but it's also built on a Nordic animist understanding of what Yule really is, which is that it's a way of relating to changing cycles of light. And these changing cycles of light in the darkest time of year in Northern Europe, it's very dark. And then there is this idea that it's dark beings that bring the light in the darkest time of year. So you see, it's an attempt to take some of the basically material of Nordic animism and say, well, let's do it somehow. So these are examples. Another thing was that I saw at some point I started realizing that there was this raven totemism that used to have been super important in Northern Europe, that there was this kinship with raven, and then I wrote a scholarly article about it that basically analyzed North European raven totemism as part of a kind of raven totemism that you find all around the Northern Hemisphere, below the Arctic Circle and above the Arctic Circle, by the way. You find these raven totemism and specific kind of raven motif, and that the North European is basically just one of those. And that then means that you can take stuff like Iron Age archaeology and ancient sagas that talk about Odin and all these kind of things, and then you can look at it from the understanding of what Haida raven totemism in the Northwest Pacific is actually, what kind of thing that is, and then you can understand actually what the North European material, you can understand that North European material in a new way. And then I created a flag, the raven flag, because that was actually a thing, and it's a little bit of a, like, almost a legendary thing, that there are these chronicles and sagas who tell about these Viking warriors and they had a raven banner. And then, but then we say, okay, well, there's other meanings in this, and that has to do with this totemism, a really important totemism. It's about connectedness with the land, and Raven as this trickster figure that brings a specific voice of adaptability and transformation in the times that we're entering here in the Anthropocene. So I basically tried, and then that flag is also, it's a material object. It's something you can use. So I made it and then presented it, for instance, in different eco-activisms and so on, and people are sometimes using it in, for instance, eco-activism, as, because the thing is with eco-activism that it has, if you have Eurodescendant eco-activism, then it is uselessly, or often uselessly, modernist.
Yeah.
Indigenous eco-activism, it works because it has a past. Because it has a past. If human beings want to create something in the world, then we narrate a past into our present and project the future that we want. That's how human beings work. But Eurodescendant eco-activism, white people's eco-activism, it doesn't really have that past. And that makes it, it makes it not strong, and it's silly because we do have the past, we're just not using it. So because of the modernist self-image,
right, because of that thing.
So that was also an attempt to sort of take this perspective and bring it into this extremely important context as a way of empowering eco-activism today, basically using animism to empower eco-activism. So you see, these are different kind of projects that I've been working on that sort of tries to, in different ways, try to do something practical in the world. Yeah.
I like it because as a scholar, you have to live kind of professionally in a conceptual world, or like an abstract world, right? An abstract life. But all of your projects are not abstract. They're like things you can touch or do or be around, or like, congregate around. You can actually like show them to children and they get it. It's not like a theory and a kid's like, what are you talking about? It's like, no, here's a
Exactly.
flag, you wave it. Here's a bird. Oh, I like the bird, like,
Yeah. Exactly.
It's like that. And so I'm curious about a few things. So one is that, like, you talked about totemism, and we had a little miniature conversation before, and there's a bit of like totemic identity versus modernist identity politics. And I think that that's a subject that I'm very interested to unpack with you. And I just want to put it on the table for now, which is like the difference between how indigenous people, or even like re-indigenous people, like re-indigenizing ourselves, how that way of identifying is vastly different than the identity wars and the identity politics we're seeing in sort of like modern culture. And then there's this other thing, which is, let me see if I can grasp it, is like, oh, just as sort of, and you can answer these in whatever way you want. We can just go from there, which is, where's the edge for you in this art making process? Because I see you making calendars filled with runes. That's very artistic. I see you making a flag that has art on it. The ceremony is super artistic, right? It's like performance art, music, masks, costumes. I'm curious where your edge is around, like, because I see you as a person that's pushing the edge of what's possible in your life and in your field, right? Like, you're actually getting out of the academy and you're doing things like, what the fuck? We're just people, we got to do stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I see you pushing the edge of the creative process, marrying the creative and the conceptual, right?
Mm,
Like you write these papers and they're highly academic and researched, and then you just go do this thing that's like accessible. You
mm.
know, it's much more accessible. So I'm curious about where the edge is for you. Like, what are you chasing still, or where are you, chiseling the being out of stone? You're like, who's in here, you know?
Mm, mm. Yeah. Well, I love the way you describe it. It sounds cool. I didn't think about it like this before, but like the kind of scholarship that I come from, where people are thinking a lot about relation all the time and animism, and we have enabled ourselves to understand gods as real and spirits as real. And you can go to Brazil and you can use the scholarship to say, okay, well, I'm a student of these people. They are graciously sharing some of their incredible knowledge to inform a dumb white dude like me a little bit, and I'm able to use that scholarship to do that. That is a quite an incredible thing. However, this kind of scholarship, the anthropology, still has a problem that it stays in talking and thinking, and some of it, like, which is also, it's quite awesome, is some of the stuff that's called the ontological turn, um, but it's almost philosophy, and it becomes so inaccessible that, well, if it's about relation, then exactly who are you relating with? In fact, you're not relating to anyone. In fact, you might actually be reproducing the most unrelational aspect of modernity that there is, and so that's kind of a little bit of a problem, and big problem, and that's also why, like stuff like making this calendar that's made with runes, and there's a wheel of seasons that composed with these runes. And what I basically did with the wheel of seasons was that I took different parts of traditional calendar and knitted them together, so it's all, I mean, I didn't come up with it, I just kind of knitted it together, right? And but then you have a thing that's packed with meaning, and which basically, as kind of the whirling machine, holds the whole thing inside it, right? And that kind of thing, or the raven flag, was a very long process to develop the design. So the design was beautiful enough to unite the raven figure with the human face, associate with the right things, kind of, but still be so simple that it can be seen on a flag, that it doesn't just become a white patch of nothing. So I had different graphic designers that I was working with on it, and developing it, because the thing is that things have to be beautiful, and they have to be appealing, and they have to reach out to people, and they have to reach out also into people's sometimes problematic, weird ideas. Like, for instance, I've been criticizing a lot the idea of Vikings, which is this kind of nostalgic, romantic idea of this illustrious, hypermasculine past and so on. But part of the thing is also that we don't follow straight roads, we follow winding roads, and perhaps for some people, that thing, that their attraction to this icon of the past is actually driven by their drive towards relatedness. That's actually what's pulling them, I think, in many cases. So there is, I have that thing, you need to get your hands dirty, and you need to speak with all the, and also, it doesn't matter that things are sometimes a little bit vulgar, or what, and also they have to be funny, things have to
Yeah.
be funny, which is, it's actually difficult. It's difficult to be funny. I'm making these YouTube videos all the time. I'm trying to kind of figure out how to communicate these super difficult issues, and trying to be funny is just super difficult, and you just risk being super offensive and just being an ass to people or something like that. Now, I don't, I don't dabble in that, but but it's a risk when you're trying to get to be funny, right? So so yeah, I think that with these uh, art things, I think it is or expressive visual expressions and so on. I think it is so important if you actually want to change stuff. I got so inspired by some black activists that I know here in Copenhagen, who made a huge statue of a of a black freedom fighter called the Fireburn Queen, who who attacked the authorities in a Danish colony in the West Indies sometime in history. So she was really a rebel leader, the leader, this black woman, and they just built a huge statue of her with a torch in one hand and stuff like that, and but they didn't have the funds to build that statue actually in bronze, which it's supposed to be built. So they built it in this what is it called in English, polystyrene. They built it in polystyrene and spray painted it black, so it looked real. And they also made the what I call the base that it's sitting on. And spray painted it so it looked like a real base with like stones and carved and stuff. So it looked like the real thing. Then it went viral all over the world. People were like, yeah, look, in Copenhagen, they raised this. I think in the first 2 weeks, there was 1 billion people who had, it was estimated, who had seen that there was now this statue in Copenhagen. The channel tours in Copenhagen, who go up and look at the Little Mermaid and then go back, they started talking about her every time they went by. So by just placing this, in fact, rather vulgar, artistically speaking, object, which is a little bit like, almost a little bit like a statue of Captain Cook or something like that. It's just the Fireburn Queen, and then they inscribed that so powerfully in the city landscape, and in the narrations going on around the city landscape, and in people's perception of that city. You see how powerful that was? How fucking powerful that was. Now it's being made in bronze because so many people have seen it, and so many people have and so that part of our history, that a black woman was a rebel leader, should actually be acknowledged as a hero of our history. She's now on in a huge, amazing statue on the harbor front in Copenhagen. Isn't that awesome? Now, that way of affecting a culture and affecting a social space through visual expression, I'm such a fan of that, and I'm not on that level myself at all, but nowhere near. But I'm just inspired by it. I think it's so beautiful, that way of operating, rather than writing something down in a flippant academic article that nobody will ever read, But yeah, and if they do, then they're the same tiny mirror cabinet group of scholars. So
right. Yeah, I mean, I trained as a performance artist and as a clown for a while, and
oh wow.
yeah, so my favorite, I have a little project that I'm developing is called Death Clowns. Death Clowns for Life. So like it's like a chant.
Cool,
It's like a
cool.
chant,
I
right?
love
Like
it
Death
already.
Clowns for Life. Death
Yeah,
Clowns for
yeah,
Life. But the point I'm trying to make is that like, or like, you know how the word fun is in funeral?
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like it's right there.
yeah.
But like, how do we highlight that so that a lot of the death phobia, we can reanimize death in a kind of like,
Mm,
in this culture that we are, like as the ceremony of funerals and of dying and of like mental illness, but also like hearing voices and going into trance, all these things
mm,
that we have sort of distanced ourselves
mm,
from in the modern world and sort of put on stage, right?
mm, mm,
Like we allow rock stars to go into trance, right?
mm,
You
mm,
know what I mean? Like we've
mm,
done this
mm,
thing where it's like, oh, we don't have shamans anymore, but
mm,
we have rock stars and movie stars. So we let them go into trance over here.
mhm,
You know, it's
mhm,
and there's something about, like the fact that we all are going to die that
mhm,
like brings it back here, right? To bring
mhm,
it back to like,
mhm.
oh, how do I think about death and not get so serious?
Yeah,
Right? Like, so, and
yeah,
I'm a big fan of like clown activists, right?
yeah.
There are clown troops around the world that they do like activist or political satire, and it's like
Mhm.
you can't really tell the difference, like Sacha Baron Cohen, right? Like on some
Yeah,
level, it's like you make it so real that you're like you can't look
yeah,
away because
yeah,
something in you is like,
yeah,
are they real? Are they fucking with me? Like, are they real?
yeah,
Is it? Because then some level it's serious
yeah,
ritual, right? It's like
yeah,
serious. And
yeah.
on another
That
level,
guy
it's
blows
like
my mind. Yeah,
it's hyper absurd, right? It's like
yeah,
both super serious and
yeah.
completely
Exactly.
absurd.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
this is the kind of work that I think gets people where they live. Like they're
yeah.
not going to read an academic article, but if they see the event or they watch the television show or they experience the play or if they, like they experience the art, then
Mm,
maybe they Google it and then read the academic article
mm,
that inspired it or something, right?
yeah, yeah.
Like this is the kind of thing that's interesting to me too, is like how do we bring a lot of these ways of thinking and then almost like hide the way of thinking, like you're masking the thought process in the
Mm,
art
mm,
process, like you're
yeah,
masking it so
yeah,
that a child could look at it and get one thing and an adult can look at it and get another thing
yeah.
because the thought process is obscured
Mm,
underneath the actual aesthetic, right?
yeah, yeah.
Like this statue with like the I bet I haven't seen it, but I'm going to look at it after. But I bet the aesthetic is such that it hits you, right? The
Mm,
aesthetic
mm,
hits you,
yeah, yeah,
and then
yeah.
it hits you so strongly you then want to know about it,
Mm,
and
mm,
then you kind of have to bore deeper into the aesthetic,
yeah,
right? You have
yeah.
to travel inside
Mm,
of the portal that
yeah.
the because on some level the statue is also totemistic, right? The statue
Mm,
becomes totemistic too.
yeah.
So
In some way, it's part of a relating system somehow. Yeah.
yeah,
Let me just mention one thing to you with regards to this death clowning thing. Um, and it's just if you can use it for something, because in the Afro-Atlantic religions they actually have this space of dead spirits, and these dead spirits are very carnivalesque and transgressive, funny, erotic, and yeah, like that, and that makes for but they're also literally there, and they are spirits of dead people. So and yeah, and you find it in different forms in these different Afro-Atlantic religions, and might be interesting for you to look at that, because
yeah.
that has actually emerged in the shape it has today. In the Afro-Atlantic religions, it has emerged in a very intense interface between Afro-Atlantic and European religiosities, because Europeans came with this thing called Spiritism, which emerged in the 19th century, and it's like this, you know what it is, right?
Yeah.
And when Spiritism met stuff like Santeria, then it just went and it was just love at first sight.
Yeah.
So Spiritism had really went into very, very tight connection with these ideas, and that also means that you sometimes find it in Europe, like in England. I read about a guy where there was some kind of spiritism going on somewhere in London or something like that, that sounded completely as if it was a Brazilian umbanda or some sort of a Palo Mayombe slash spiritismo sort of thing, that was just like, it sounded exactly like that. It was just in some corner of London. So anyway, this is just to say that I think there are powerfully animist things going on out there that you could probably perhaps derive some inspiration from.
Oh no, that's great. I might even email you after to just be like, do you have any books or websites? Because I mean, I'm not pretending that these ideas come from me either.
Okay, okay,
Like my
no,
ancestors are probably being like, hey, you need to do this thing, whisper down the bloodline and stuff like that,
yeah,
Which is also the thing about like animism doesn't have to be serious. It
No,
often
I
is,
think
but it doesn't have to be.
that's a point that one of the points from Tyson Juncker where he's interested in these things about learning and knowledge and how those things really work. And he and he has this hilarious criticism of the emergence of of the Western world school system as a way of weaponizing boredom to make people more stupid because because if things are supposed to be, if you're supposed to actually grow with something or realize stuff, that has to be a little bit fun, because if you're laughing at something, then it means that new connections are being made inside your head. There's a catharsis going on, and this is a what do you call it? A reward reaction that your body is giving you. Now your brain is doing something good for your survival skills or whatever. You know, you're getting smarter right now. So and that's why humor, he says, is so important to have as an ongoing part of developing knowledge and developing yeah and and so it's also why it's really important to safeguard the capacity to be humoristic,
Totally.
basically.
Yeah, I'm so with you, and I'm so excited. What I want to get into for the last part of this, interview today and this conversation we're having is hearkening back to some of the conversation we had before, linking it to the sort of identity, a totemistic identity, and the sort of non-totemistic modern identities that we sort of have, because, you know, I don't know about you, but like living here in the Pacific Northwest, I lived for about 15 years in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and that's a very different culture, right? So it's very interesting that like we have this new understanding of um, the meta narratives that are controlling people essentially. Like, you have right wing identitarianism, you have left wing identitarianism, neoliberalism, you have all of these shades of these different demarcations of like basically how you've been a puppet, right? Like how you've been controlled, how you've been raised. Like, oh, I didn't have any control over how my parents raised me, and that fucked me up, and now I have PTSD. You have all of these various ways that now people are illuminating their precondition, right? Their context, right? Like
Mm,
people, this isn't a conversation a lot of people were having 20 years ago, but now
mm,
more and more people, and I think it's partially because of the reflective nature of social media,
mm,
is that you can actually start to see patterns, like larger meta patterns of like context, like, oh, these people over here totally act like that. And it's like stereotypes, but not really. It's like you
mm,
start to see patterns of behavior, right?
mm,
And they start to become almost celebritized, right? You've got the QAnon conspiracy people and this
mm,
kind of mixture of right wing and hippies and new age. And it's like a
mm,
weird mixture. And
mm.
then you have this mixture of like Proud Boys and alt right and alt light, and they're sort of fascist, but then you mix that with like eco fascists, right? And it's
Uh,
like, wait, you love the earth, but you're also kind of eugenists. Like, what, right? Like, it's
yeah,
very,
yeah,
so
yeah.
so I guess what I want to get into in a light way, because I know it's a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, but honestly, sometimes that sensitivity is too sensitive, right? It's
Mm,
too sensitive. And you had this great thing about brittle. You
mm,
were talking about this, and you had this great term, and I wonder if you just want to riff on that a little bit, because that term you used earlier, like brittle identity or something like that, was just
mm,
so, I think, spot on. And also there was a direction about the inward gaze versus the outward gaze of like indigenous identity.
mm.
And so I just really want to highlight that from you, and just tell us a story about that
Yeah.
from your point of view.
Yeah, it's something that I'm thinking a lot about, and I'm struggling how to articulate it. Partly because these culture wars are so polarized, and and uh, and I find, for instance, that an unrelating unrelenting and unambiguous and, in fact, aggressive anti-racism and resistance to other kinds of bigotry it's even more important when you do what I do, which is you looking at Euro traditionalism, stuff that has been weaponized in these ways of hurting people. It's even more important when you're doing like that than if you're anybody else. It's important if you are anybody else, but it's more important if you're me.
Yeah.
And that's so I'm really trying to tread carefully, even though it's not necessarily always in my nature. But the thing is that identitarianism is a very modern thing that is based on this modern ruptured perception of the world. The seclusion, the loneliness, the cosmic tristesse that we're talking about before, that is somehow connected with identitarianism. And it's not my place as a Danish person to criticize a Greenlandic nationalism, identitarianism, because it's created as a response to oppression that my people have exposed them to. But that puts us in a little bit of a pickle, because I'm a white people, and we white people have the evilest and most destructive identitarianisms that there are. And we have to deal with them. And this is not for somebody else to do, dealing with those things. We need to do it. And that means that we have to, basically face up to identitarianism and be extremely vigilant when these identitarianisms start hacking themselves into perceptions and languages that are supposed to create respectful and kind and harmonious ways of meeting people, right? Because that's actually a little bit what I'm seeing. I think that the complex of behavior that some people call wokeism, or I think I would call it woke identitarianism, and which is rooted in what is called identitarian turn scholarship. But an identitarian turn scholarship is rarely understood by the people who are being very aggressive with it. But that has things that we need to start talking about in new ways and thinking about in new ways. I think we need to find other ways of being woke, and perhaps animism or relationalism could give us new tools for how to be woke. Because when the identitarianism, I see it as extremely dangerous when the universalizing, almost colonizing of identitarianism, when that goes into white people. Like, if you're watching this on YouTube and you got this far and you haven't kind of thought about the last 500 years of human history, then let me just be the one to tell you that white nationalism is not what anybody needs. In fact, we need to not get it. And so, this is just to say that I think identitarianism is a problem, and it is defining progressive discourses too much these days. Yeah. And as an alternative, I think that the relationalism that you mentioned, totemism, like totemism is a model for self-image, where you are creating your self-image from kinship with other. You are reaching out of yourself in order to create that self-image. I'm Raven Clan. That's a group of humans and a group of other than humans that are a kinship group. Whereas I am Danish, or I am white. That is a Danishness or a whiteness, an interiorized thing that is inside. And when you are and like, again, Tyson Junkerporter's thinking from that perspective seems very, these identitarianism seems very much like products of power trying to create compliance systems to people. So in pre-Christian Nordic practice, people had a thing called Finnfala, which was visiting the Sami, the indigenous peoples of northern Scandinavia, and that was a way of creating, like, cultural exchange. in order for culture to stay dynamic, to stay transformative, to stay alive and stay moving with the land. But when state building started kicking off in the Middle Ages, then that and Christianity came in and became part of the state building project. Then you see these laws starting in the medieval laws, like you cannot continue doing the Finnfara, the cultural exchange practice with the Sami. So so these are ways of building self-image and building culture that are non-identitarian. And like if you go to the Northwest Pacific in America and Canada, you're already there, so you can probably go out and ask them. You will probably find that Raven totemism is there across peoples who speak widely different languages. You find the same in northern Sweden. You find that bear totemism, bear kinship is shared among Swedish people, Sami people, and Finnish people who are living in the same area. Of course, they're living in the same area. It's animism. It's about land relating. It's not about worshipping my inner cultural essence, right? It's about relating to bear. And I think that these kind of concepts could serve as markers for us to move in the direction of better ways of being woke or transformed ways of being woke, where we are dealing critically with the identitarianism problem.
Totally. Two things, because this is like a conversation I just really enjoy having with people who really sort of get it from different angles, is like, one is that, like, if you look at sort of the etymology or the root of like woke, it sort of stems from, I think it's telling that when modern white discourse steals and absorbs things from Black or brown indigenous cultures, they always decontextualize it. So now we have people saying woke when what they really mean are white progressives weaponizing wokeness. And they say, well, no, all wokeness is that. Yeah. But I like to go back to like thinking about the actual context, which is, probably more or less, and this is my mythology, so I'm not trying to be perfect, I'm trying to be relatable, which is Black and brown and indigenous students in academic colleges in the West waking up to the fact that they are inside of enemy territory, right? Like they're in an academic setting, learning about themselves, recognizing that the setting itself is trying to colonize them as they're trying to uncolonize themselves. So if you take it from that context, then if I tell you stay woke, that is a very different, that's almost a totemistic spell casting. That's like telling you when you go into the enemy's territory, when you go to class, don't fall asleep. Don't get enchanted by the thing that we're trying to disenchant, right? Stay woke.
Yeah.
So
no, I have to say I haven't been so aware of the history of that term.
Yeah.
I just I knew kind of where it comes from. It comes from African Americans, right? Or
yes, yeah. I mean,
okay.
it's a slang term that I didn't create and I don't use, but I find it very telling that when these words come from marginalized people who are fighting against oppressive systems, they then become co-opted and weaponized by multiple different agents in the white or non-Black communities, right? It's like, because now we have sort of alt-right leaning people being like woke this, woke that, wokeistan, don't, like all this derogatory thing. And then we have sort of like neoliberal white people who are also very lonely, doing the same kind of thing, but they're like weaponizing woke in a different way. So I just think it's interesting that like it's mutated, right? It's mutated. And I think we have to drill down behind the word that we're using to actually get into the nervous system relational patterning that is both, like, because we said this earlier, both the far left and the far right are exhibiting the same kinds of behaviors. They just have different narratives.
Totally. And what I was thinking about using that word specifically was actually self-identifying with it because it has been it feels like it has been going bad. And I'm not sure if that was a wise choice, but that was actually I was thinking about basically making a video proposing a new kind of wokeness and say I want to be that kind of woke. And I'm not sure how wise it was, but that was sort of my idea with it. But I'm also I'm seeing some weird dynamics playing out, because when you are communicating about Nordic history, religion, and Norseness and stuff that has a little bit to do with Vikings and stuff like that, then what you get is you get a very broad spectrum of political positions. You get strong queer empowerment insisting identity politics people who are very vocal. You get very vocal Nazis almost. Like I've been running my own little cancel culture regime on my Czech channel and basically blocking the right wing out of it to a fairly large extent. But I still sometimes see these altercations, and the weird thing is sometimes you see them actually you see the lines blurring between them. So you see white supremacist people using woke language, talking about Eurocentrism and cultural appropriation and blah blah blah, and or you see strong empowerment focused people using a word like mongrelization all of a sudden, where you're a little bit like, okay, so what is the next, like, contamination of the Aryan race, and so and this is all I'm seeing literally these lines being blurred, and that is that's also what's scaring me about this identitarianism, because I feel that it risks reproducing whiteness as this ridiculous traffic accident of history in very unfortunate ways.
Yeah. Well, I think it does reproduce whiteness because you see it. You see people who haven't fully examined where they're coming from and why they're coming from those stances. Like, what are the fears and the pains and the ancestral traumas and all this shit? Like, why are you even caring so much? Why do you even speak this way? It's, from some kind of pain inside of you or some kind of fear about losing something that you never really had, because the state is kind of controlling us, and it's just very annoying. But the thing that I'm more interested in is, because here's the practicality of it. Like, all of these things are concepts. Wokeism and not blah, blah, blah. It's all concepts, and people just start getting into a war of abstraction. And what I was really interested in is, we were talking earlier, and I'm just going to summarize it. It's that, like, this kind of dangerous identitarianism is always like inwardly referencing, right? It's like referencing inside itself constantly. So, but this kind of, maybe let's just be silly and call it woke animism or indigenous wokeness or something, because it's real. And woke is like a term for alert and aware. So, it's good. It's good to be aware. But this thing about indigenous cultures and people who are re-animizing themselves, they are referencing outside themselves for both wisdom, knowledge, and sort of like checking, right? Like a kind of bullshit checking. It's like when you reference outside yourself, it's a little bit harder to continually bullshit yourself in your own narrative. Because if you're like, I want to be related to this other being, whether that's Raven or whether that's your grandma or whether that's your friend or whether that's a river, if you're referencing outside yourself, then you have to be able to look at the consequences of your actions, like very clearly, because it's like, oh, this thing I did hurt my friend, and my friend now doesn't like me, and I want my friend to like me. So I need to, like, correct myself in some way. I need to reference my identity outside of my shell. Whereas identitarianism is constantly churning inside of itself And then we see this fragility or this brittleness that happens because even a word can somehow like shatter the
Yeah.
fragile shell of of the identity, right?
Yeah, yeah, yes, totally. And the reaching out that you're talking about, that's also, it's inherently transformative. Like if you are creating kinship with other, then you are transforming, and that's important. In the Old Norse mythology, there's a myth of the Aesir, the gods, and the Jotnar, the trolls, forces of order and forces of chaos, and they're super interrelated. They make babies and have sex and marry and identify and play games and fight in all kinds of ways and all kinds of social contracts and all that kind of stuff. Million webs of relation. Then what happens is that all this reaching between these two categories, these two fundamental cosmic categories, all that relation breaks down, and then they go into total war, cosmic total war, and that is the Ragnarok. The relatedness has broken down, and then everything clashes. Now, what I feel that I'm seeing today, for instance, on the internet, is these algorithm produced mirror cabinets that enclose people in these spaces where the relating stops, and when that relating stops, then things become sort of aggressive and toxic and clash-y somehow. And that's also, I think, these enclosed media spaces with where we are being fed that reality that the algorithms with fairly high level of precision know that we will keep our attention caught to the maximum, meaning also that it's actually poking at our fears and our and these things. That reality is, like from the traditional knowledge perspective, I think of North European traditional knowledge, it's apocalyptic. It's Ragnarok reality that we're moving towards, and this is also, and it's related again with these identitarian enclosed style ways of thinking of self, which then also produce, as you say, the trolling slash fragility culture, that the brittle subjectivity, that just the sight of something other makes people totally flip. And this counts so much for right wingers, and it counts so much for left wingers. Often, is for some reason, left wingers are a little bit more accused of this, and it is a good thing accusing us for it because we totally do it. But right wingers do it just as much. That, like this thing about Northern Europe, we have a huge Islamophobia problem. So some Muslims do something in public space, and then there are these harsh reactions from the right wing, and it's just like seeing other creates that reaction. Or the same thing with sexual non-heteronormative sexual positions can also make right-wingers react like completely as if it's offensive to them that somebody has a position that's other in relation to them. On the left wing, it's also fragility. And I know a guy who's teaching. I don't know him. I met a guy who's teaching anthropology at one of the great universities in England, Oxford or Cambridge, something like that. And he was saying that he was talking about suicide in his lectures, and then he was actually reported to the principal's office in the university for not including trigger warnings because somebody had experienced suicide in the students. You cannot teach cultural studies without talking about suicide, because the first book of sociology is called The Suicide, and that is so these fragility practices are I think they're very non-initiatory. They're very non-initiatory and they're very non-animist. And this is part of what I think an animist wokeness, if we should use that term, could perhaps teach us. Let me give you an example of initiatory practice. I'm not going to talk about secret things, but when in Candomblé, when that's a religion that is to a large extent practiced by black women in Brazil. These black women come from a group of enslaved Africans that were exposed to some of the most extreme and atrocious and horrific oppression that humans have invented on each other ever. And it's fairly close to our day in Brazil. It's not as far away as it is in other parts of the Americas, I think. Okay, so when they go into initiation, these or into candomblé, then there are motives of enslavement are actively being used in the candomblé. They're being enslaved symbolically to deities that they're being initiated to, perhaps symbolically raped by these deities. These deities are imaged with signs and symbols that associate with colonial power. Sometimes the Orisha are even imaged as white people. See how extreme this is? This is trigger pressing.
Yeah.
Is extreme trigger pressing. Now, going through this process is an extreme process of empowerment. These people build a personal, spiritual, cultural, and social power that is so effective, so real, so functional, and has had this incredible historic capacity to empower them. So you see how the identitarian or this non-identitarian way of, in this case, thinking about empowerment or handling empowerment can actually yield, I think, powerful allies for people all around the world to for instance, recreate stuff like land connectedness and also I think in, like, for instance, in the deconstruction of whiteness, I think it's probably going to have to be a necessity to get past somehow the fragility and the brittle subjectivities somehow.
I mean, I am so with you because from what I've learned, from what I've practiced, and I'm not like initiated in anything, and I've just like been a lay person who really has sort of kept going, right? Like listening and trying and really breaking my own self apart, and that's in dialogue with the living world. It's not like me on my own trying to be a shaman. It's like me going, I really want to pierce the veil of reality and like hear and see and it's often that like you eventually meet death, right? You eventually have to meet something or some multiple stages of a dying to yourself, ego death, torture, disease, ancestral memories of this stuff. Like this stuff just happens, right? It's like
Hmm.
um I've often thought about like how do we, as sort of like a loose conglomerate or network of kind of like colleagues who are both ritualists and scholars and stuff, how do we help white people sort of meet their whiteness in such a way that in these ritual ways, they actually sort of die to themselves because it's not about punishing white people for being white. It's
Hmm.
about going through your lineage in such a way that you can actually experience and transform the kind of poisonous behaviors that caused whiteness to begin in the first place.
Hmm.
You know, because this is what I had to do. I'm a mixed race person, so I'm going
Hmm.
back in my lineage, seeing white people kill brown babies and actually relating to all of the people in that vision,
Hmm.
right? Like I
Hmm.
have to switch my consciousness or my emotional gut awareness between like the colonizer coming to
Hmm.
like the Caribbean and killing Taino people and then bringing slaves, and also the Taino people and the slaves. And I just have to keep kind of spiraling around
mm,
because all of that is in my blood, right?
mm,
And
yeah,
I talk about this in terms of death practice of like, you have to
mm,
practice dying, which means you have to practice going into what you fear the most and coming out of it again.
mm,
And I do
yes,
think that, because white people don't necessarily have a kind of intact system of elders and all this stuff that we really want to have, right? Like you
mm,
want people to help you through this shit, right?
yeah, mm.
I do
I
feel
think,
like they're just, I don't know, there's just a lot
yeah,
there for me of like, how do we help white people like inhabit themselves again to such an extent that they could actually feel everything we're talking about, both of the oppressor and the oppressed, right? You
yeah,
have to feel both,
mm, yeah,
positions, right?
yeah. I think I see people starting to really think with these things, and in America, like people always talk in bad ways about America, and there are probably a lot of good reasons for that, but there's also incredible cultural renewal and reflections going on. I'm was invited to teach a class at a course called Before We Were White, uh, which are some people who are they're called White Awake, and they're basically about getting white Americans together. Not just white. It's like anybody can basically participate, but then they're reflecting on some of the things that you're talking about there, and bringing people. They're pulling in different indigenous teachers who are then talking about these things with people, and different teachers. There's particularly one guy that I would mention for the reflection that you're having there, and that is a Burkinabe thinker called Malidoma Somé. Have you heard the name?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay,
He
you know
just
him. You
died.
know him.
He just
Did
died.
he?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh
he just
man.
died.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, but his books are probably still out there. But I because I think he has lived in the U.S. and he has,
yeah,
so he has gotten the question. It seemed a gazillion times of how do I relate to my ancestors when my ancestors did bad things, and he had some reflection that was. It seemed intuitively powerful and meaningful, which was something about death as a mirror, as
yeah,
and that those spirits um, are, can be positive, perhaps exactly as a function of their human faults and dependence on bad things. And this is like if we spoke earlier about these things about the Carnivalesque dead that you find in many of the Afro descendant cults, and also in the European um, dead cults. These dead are not angels,
yeah,
they are prostitutes with rum in one hand and a big cigar in another. And I mean, and so I think that these like carnivalesque and mirroring ways of engaging past would probably be, they would have the dynamism and the transformative capacity for the kind of reflection that you're doing there.
totally.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, there are some traditions that sort of survived in Euro clown, like Commedia dell'arte,
mhm,
and these grotesque caricatures of like archetypal beings that you might meet in like middle age, Europe, and then taking that and really going into that. And, to me, it's a channeling. Like those people are channeling on some
mhm,
level. They are wearing the mask of this like creature and they're channeling. And I
mhm,
just think that like white culture needs to remember that it sort of it sort of decontextualized its magical processes into like theater. It
mm,
turned like magic
mm,
into theater.
mm,
And there's a bit of like coming back
mm,
from theater into just like ceremonial ritual that allows one to basically metabolize these
mm.
energies instead
Yeah,
of just like, that's over there and that's my bad ancestor and now I'm over here and
yeah,
I'm lonely.
yeah.
Instead, you have to like,
Yeah,
you have to like, you have to metabolize and go, oh shit,
yeah,
I can
yeah,
feel
yeah,
and digest and this kind of process of turning oneself inside out.
yeah.
And then knowing that on the other side of that, you're going to be able to be well. Because I think that for a lot of white Euro people, they've lost the structure that actually cares, like aftercare. It's like
Mm.
do the crazy thing, but then you have to like go to the tent that like smudges you and like washes your face.
Yeah, yeah.
Like there's a process by
Mm,
which we get
mm,
messy, but then we get clean again, right? Like, and
yeah,
I think that there's something here about
yeah.
just reweaving an animism that is both deeply about mutual aid and disability care and justice,
Mm,
and also just has that ritual initiatory rupturing
mm,
as part of it. It's like
yeah.
you rupture and then you get sewn back together, and then you rupture and you get sewn back together. And something about that makes you more robust,
Mm,
not more fragile,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
You become
Totally.
more robust. And that's what
Yeah,
you're talking about with the condomble, Black
yeah,
women. They're
yeah,
becoming more robust by metabolizing their ancestors' trauma
yeah,
and not avoiding it.
yeah.
But they're doing it in a
That's a
ritual
good point.
setting. They're
Yeah,
doing it in a ritual setting, right?
yeah. Yeah, I recommend go if I don't know how much you look at my channel, but I have a video there that's called "The Phallus and the Wild Goddess," where I'm actually showing some recordings of, and this is one of these dead spirits, and an amazing ritual that
Yeah.
I participated in. This goddess said, "Now, you guys filmed this stuff. Now take it out, and show it to people." And we were a little bit like, "Yeah, but this is the craziest thing we've ever been a part of." Okay, but
Cool.
and the wild thing about that is that this uh, that there I then later retrospectively remembered that the absolute craziest source there is on North European religion recounts a ritual that is almost identical in Norway, where it's a carnivalesque sexual ritual where the funny thing is that uh, heterosexual men or men who prefer to have sex with women are supposed to sort of symbolically have sex with the phallus, and that's funny. That's just
Yeah.
that is an example of a ritual that in this case is abusive to the heterosexual man, and probably kind of a this kind of okay, we're molding your subjectivity a little bit.
Right.
Um,
The queering of something that is like the queering of something that is static into something that is a little more flexible and
yeah,
plural.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly,
Cool.
exactly. Yeah.
Rune, I just want to thank you so, so much for this freaking awesome conversation. We're
Well,
going to
thank
wrap
you.
it up. We're going to wrap it up here. We're going to put lots of video links and lots of websites stuff in the show notes. So just so everyone listening, like that's going to be there for you. But are there any things you'd like to say in closing? Anything at all, Rune?
Um, Not really. I think this was an awesome conversation, and I hope I didn't rant too much. I have a tendency to start ranting, and and all you guys, you can find me if you look for Nordic Animism on Insta, YouTube, Facebook, and all those places. And yeah, I think that's basically it.
Great. Well, blessings to you and all your relations. Blessings to all the relations of everyone who is listening. Thanks so much for engaging in these chats I'm having with people from around the world. I hope it does you and your people some good. So thank you all so much. Everything that's new, we have a new website. It's animistarts.art. And I still have my old website, bodyalter.org. And you can find all the information there. And me and Larissa will continually be doing more events and more more experiences, and we're just in constant dialogue. So thank you so much. Again, thank you to Rune. Thank you to Nordic Animism. And bye bye. We're going to stop the recording now. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.